I just want the soft life. But then the more extreme version of that is what's called trad wives. And the term...
Dude, that's so scary.
Right. So it's scary because it's like the most extreme version of if you take that soft life kind of aesthetic and weaponize it and dominate it and control it and make it more extreme and more intense in its core, then what you get is like the trad wives movement. Welcome to another episode of Sage Takes Time. I'm Amira.
I'm Elissa.
And today we're going to talk about America.
America! You are American on paper.
Yeah, I am a naturalized citizen of the United States, yes.
Yes.
But I am Egyptian.
I'm a blood member of the United States.
Blood member?
Yeah, I'm half American, but I'm not a citizen of the United States.
Oh.
Fun fact.
Interesting. And that is the mindfuck that is American politics in one like. So I just want to say that I'm not wearing this shirt to support a political party. It was a coincidence that I wore this specific tone of blue, which I actually don't usually wear, this color, but I bought it for the show because I thought it looked cute.
It's beautiful on you.
It's not meant to be a Democrat blue. Not that I support the other side, but I support neither.
Right.
Anyway, but the idea is that why and how do like American politics, social movements, US discourse shape global politics and global discourse about everything?
Yeah.
And specifically, we're not going to talk about everything because that's going to take 20 weeks, but we're going to talk about in specific how it relates to like women's issues and how it affects the discourse around women's issues. Yeah.
It's very much an aspect that tends to be criticized as to like, why do we bring up US culture, US politics, US laws when we are, for the most part, representing this region and this community that is not necessarily American or related to the US in any way, shape, or form. But it is important to actually dive into that and highlight beyond just our own individual strange relationships to the United States.
Yeah.
Why is this former superpower so important and so influential in our regional politics and mindsets and trends?
Yeah. It's interesting that you said former superpower also. I'm kind of stuck on that now.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I remember being 18 years old when Obama was elected and thinking that former president, Bush too, I remember thinking that was the decline, the beginning of the end of the American empire. And that we were going to be lucky enough in our lifetimes to witness the fall of an empire, which I think was actually a very like advanced way of thinking for an 18-year-old at that time. But in learning a lot of history and like history that would take years, hundreds of years sometimes for empires to rise and fall, what we would learn in class, we were seeing that the US empire grew very rapidly over half a century really at that time. And that everything that rises fast will fall fast. And that was the beginning when US foreign policy was starting to wane. And there was a lot of repercussions in the Middle East because of the choices of the Bush administration. And that maybe the PR play of Obama coming into power might save the US in terms of like its marketing, but it wasn't necessarily going to save this empire from collapsing as the world got more connected and more informed and more globalized.
Because we have this like Audat al-Khawaja or like this foreigner complex in the region, a lot of times there's like the American morals and values and rights and freedoms are used as a reference point or a benchmark for the rest of the world. Now, that's all a marketing branding thing. Behind that facade is a shit ton of issues that are coming to light. I mean, you mentioned Bush, but for me, like when really that mask started to fall, or that facade was crumbling, was really Trump the first time around. And given that this is an election year, America suddenly, like, again, in a much more aggressive way, dominates the spotlight of mainstream media and of regional conversations around political things, but also social issues. And so that's kind of why we wanted to touch on that.
Yeah.
And given the developments of the last year, with many of the masks dropping off of like people and celebrities and activists and politicians and countries as a whole, I think it's important to finally disengage and dissociate idealistic morals and values and liberties for like us as humans and citizens of the world and our individual countries, to dissociate them from America and from whatever dream they're trying to sell us. And they've been successfully selling us through like the soft power of media, entertainment, culture that has gone global, and really re-examine that and disengage from it. Disengage, but like towards what? I'm not sure. Hopefully something that's much more authentic to our different cultures and communities around the world, that stems from their needs and their values and their rights. And it's not a reference point. So it's sad to see the US being such a crumbling false democracy. Like, it's not real, you know? It's like there are the workings and the frameworks of a democratic system, but it's not as free as you would think it is. And we see, particularly when we're talking about like women's rights, we're seeing this wave, the counter wave, the progress you make in one issue or for one cause. If you feel like for a while you're making like good steps forward, usually there's some sort of backlash that comes as a very strong counter wave to whatever progress is being made.
Yeah. And a lot of people I think were really shocked by is how vocal and how public that backwards movement has been.
Yeah.
Like seeing people proudly support the removal of rights and the deterioration of social protections and the kind of dismissal of the strength for women that has been like that so many people fought so hard to establish in the first place. Like now there's this whole movement of like women's freedom of choice that has been co-opted by people who are very much against women's freedom point blank, let alone just of choice. But it's like, you know how a lot of feminists will say like, oh, it's not about women having a right to be in the workplace. It's about women having the right to choose whether they want to be in the workplace or whether they want to opt out of that and be at home. And that a woman who is by choice staying at home deserves as much right as a woman in the workplace, and that there's unpaid labor that takes place at home that's very often overlooked. Like that dialogue has been quite central over the last decade. And recently now, there's a whole ass movement online of women choosing the right to resubscribe to patriarchal systems and old ways of thinking and gender roles and dynamics that we thought we moved beyond.
Yeah.
And kind of like voluntarily giving up a lot of the security that can come from financial independence or that can come from general autonomy and agency in their life.
Which I want to make clear, like in many respects, like that's fine if that's because we are talking about like freedom of choice and everything. And if you're subscribing to a certain way of life, that's okay. I think what's important to know in this episode is that whatever the issue is when it comes to women, it's usually weaponized by different political streams in a way that makes it work against us. So, for example, there's a couple of examples I want to give.
Give me your top line example.
The first one.
The first big one.
Well, on a major level that a lot of people will relate to is the conversation around abortion rights in America over the last 4 or 5 decades, and the way that it's been used by opposing political groups to seemingly talk about women's issues, but what's actually happening is they're weaponized against women and in a way that is meant to polarize society
fragment society.
Yeah, and fragment it, but really polarize it. Like you end up with these two binaries, like you're either pro-life or you're pro-choice.
Yeah.
And what people, I mean, some people are realizing this more and more, but what a lot of the time goes missing is that the idea of which party takes on the pro-life or pro-choice side has shifted in the previous decades. So it actually started off as a very like Republican Party issue of pro-choice.
Yeah.
And we're not going to get into that because that's like a whole other thing that I'm not like super well versed on. But the idea that that's how it began a few decades ago and pushing that narrative forward because it was in their benefit. And then it was co-opted by the other side for also political gain. And over time, it became like a very Democrats issue.
Yeah. Same with civil rights, by the way, and equality in terms of ethnicity and race recognition and things like that. Like, started as a Republican issue, was only taken up as a Republican issue because it was needed in order to win over the Confederate states. It's now been completely flipped. And so what I'd like to understand is, what do you mean by weaponized? Like, can you explain how a movement is weaponized?
It's a difficult question to answer, but I'm going to try.
Well, I'm throwing it at you, Amira. This is what you do.
It's to detach an ideology or a movement or a cause from its core accurate essence of what it's actually trying to accomplish, what it's actually trying to do, to kind of like nitpick it and like unravel it a bit so that it becomes a bunch of like maybe scattered, fragmented thoughts on a very superficial level. And then you begin demonizing those little elements of what makes up this ideology or this movement or the fight for this thing. And then focused away on those little parts that can be easily misconstrued, misidentified, mislabeled, therefore weaponized against the people trying to fight for that cause.
Right. So in the example of abortion rights, that's the core issue, is should women have access to reproductive services and health services if they need it and if they so choose. And that's now been broken down to, are you pro-life or are you, and even just that title, or are you pro-choice? Like, whereas pro-choice includes pro-life, but now they've created a category of pro-life, in which case there's now beef.
It's actually deeper than that.
Whoa.
What people don't realize is Roe versus Wade, as an example of something that was rolled back and like completely undone, is the basis upon which a lot of other civil liberties in America are actually founded. So all of these things with Roe versus Wade and abortion rights, as an example, are based on certain clauses in an amendment
of the Constitution
that supposedly stipulates that all humans have equal rights and opportunities and right to due process and whatever. So when people are debating things like abortion rights, and it's taken up to the level of the Supreme Court, a lot of like the findings and the verdicts that come out and the rulings are not based on, oh, you convinced me. You know, it's like, oh, you're saying that women should have bodily autonomy? Sure. If you tell me enough and like in a very powerful way, I'll be convinced as like a Supreme Court judge. No, this is a constitutional court. They have to base it on constitutional things that exist in the US Constitution. So the amendment that is based on is the same amendment that other things are based on. Other things like
ethnicity, sexuality, recognized as discriminatory if used against the person.
Sure. There are other things like marriage equality, for example, or other things like immigration rights. The idea of being like a naturalized US citizen, like that if you come to the US land and seek asylum, for example, what rights and protections do you have? A lot of the laws around that come from and are like, they stem from this source of this amendment right. So that's the actual, like that political side that's weaponizing these issues. That's their ultimate goal.
Right.
It's not abortion.
Yeah. It's framing the Constitution in a way that suits their desire.
It's white supremacy. The ultimate goal is not abortion. They don't give a fuck about women, to be honest, like, which is obvious, but it goes even beyond what we think. They don't give a fuck about women, so they want to like take away women's rights. No, it's much, much bigger than that. Like the ultimate goal of all of these little like cases in Supreme Court, مش عارفة إيه, and these debates and conversations is white supremacy. It's to like roll us back to a time when race and the white race like reigns supreme to everybody else, and not just in America, but globally.
Look, I feel like she says white supremacy and we need to go like a graphic over our heads of like, white supremacy is a thing. From what you're telling me, I'm grasping the gravity of the situation and the importance of that understanding when it comes to the United States.
Right.
What I think gets over a lot of the people's heads is how then does that affect young Sri Lankan living in Dubai or a young Egyptian woman? Like, how does that have repercussions to our part of the world and completely different cultures and generations?
Well, because we still live in a colonial world, unfortunately. We're not like post-colonial, just like we're not post-feminist. So unfortunately, you said like earlier, the US is like a former superpower, which surprised me because it still is very much a superpower. There are other superpowers and there's like this war that's constantly playing out, you know, but what happens in American politics is very much like an indicator of the social and political movements that are currently simmering across the world. Okay. And they're a very good sign of like what kind of conversations we can be expecting, and we can be, you know what I mean? Like they do affect global politics and global social movements.
But how? Because, for example, I'm thinking about other superpowers. Okay, let's say China.
Yeah.
Social politics in China do not carry the same gravity and discourse for the rest of the world. Even though economically and politically, the choices that are made in that country do have repercussions. But when it comes to women and women's rights, we don't feel the same, you know, reverberation. So why and how America?
America still, in its political superpowerdom, it still also has a lot of dominance in the cultural sphere, in the entertainment space, in the media landscape, in the region particularly that we're talking about here where we are. It's a very active player all the time. Like whether we realize it or not, in different countries, they have like military bases, they can mobilize whenever they want. They affect a lot of like the relationships between different political regimes. I mean, America is very much a present where we are as well. It's a country, it's physically, it's far away geographically, but it's not as far away with its ideologies and its political and social discourse as it is geographically. Right. It's much closer to home.
It's actually closest to home because like number one most used social networking app is Instagram.
Yeah.
Which is American.
Well,
which decides what people care about or don't care about or see or don't see in our part of the world. We don't have a regional Instagram or any global Instagram that's independent from American ideologies.
Yeah. And we've seen what that can do during times of conflict that are deeply affecting our region. Like with Palestine this past year, we saw how much like shadow banning, censorship there was with MENA. We can talk a lot about like the algorithmic whatever, but at the end of the day, they're very much aligned with US political values and support for Israel. Because at the end of the day, Meta is an American company and it has to answer to the US Congress, and that. There's also a very good contrast here, which is TikTok, which is growing
Chinese also.
Chinese. Well, I mean, that's like the whole thing. And it's not Chinese. It's like one of the companies that invest in it is Chinese, but the CEO is Singaporean. But it's not an American app.
And it was just banned, I think. It was like 2 days ago they banned it.
There's been attempts to ban TikTok in America for a few years now, and they're getting more and more serious. And one of the reasons is because it's a much more open space, and the algorithm works much differently to Meta algorithms. And so, for example, again, when it came to Palestine, content creators and people that were trying to like do news reports and educate their audience around this topic, in a much more accurate and objective way that doesn't necessarily fall in line with US policies were gaining a lot more success on TikTok than they were anywhere else. And so people suddenly had access to information, and they know that TikTok users are the like Gen Z, much younger audiences. So they're kind of losing control. They being like the government, and whatever, US administration is losing control of the narrative because there are other people now doing the storytelling and the content creations. So this is one example where when that like control gets away from them, you can see how they're trying to reel it back.
Like they recently passed a bill that basically associates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, which are two completely different things. But if that's registered in the United States as hate speech, Meta's hate speech laws will then associate all of the content that falls under anti-Zionism as anti-Semitic, and therefore your page will be blocked, you can be removed, your content removed. What about women? Like the soft power narratives that we're seeing in the American cultural movement that have very dangerous repercussions for the rest of the world.
Right. So this is where it kind of trickles down to us through social media. So there's a lot of like trends that I tend to find very problematic on social media.
Shocking even.
Shocking. Well, they started out like light, but then again, they're being weaponized now. So now they're getting much more aggressive. So I would say it started off with more like this idea of like the soft life. That's like the harmless version of it.
What is the soft life? Because I don't actually know that term.
The soft life is like kind of what you were saying before, like mainly women that are kind of tired and exhausted by the feminist attempt to smash the patriarchy. Like I'm gonna use like jargon that's a bit easier. But we're tired from fighting the patriarchy. Who said we want to work? I just want the soft life. And the soft life is I get to like wake up, go get my coffee, do yoga, and then come back home and make dinner and whatever.
Slow life. Almost. I would call it like slow living, slow life.
Sure, but
peaceful. It sounds nice.
It sounds great. And I want to say that like I'm not bashing that as a way of life if that's what you want. But the problematic area is that was then co-opted by the alt-right. I'm going to say like scary. Like, sorry to use like the alt-right.
I want another graphic. The alt-right.
These things are being co-opted by more right-wing mindsets and right-wing creators that are very much aligned with the hard right, not just like the Republican Party. Like they've gone beyond the Republican thinking into far right, alt-right kind of manipulation of the function women should play in society. It's very Handmaid's Tale. If you've ever read The Handmaid's Tale.
Or watched the show.
Which
is terrifying.
The whole point of why that's such a strong story is because it's super realistic, even though it's like it's supposed to be like a piece of fiction. But the whole point of that story is that the sudden shift in society and how women can function and be and how much they can be controlled to get to that very extreme place where you're living in like a place where you could have to all wear red and your body is totally controlled by other, like that doesn't happen overnight. That shift happens very slowly over time by shifting small things in the narrative and storytelling and laws around women and women's bodies and women's issues that then take you to this place. So in the early story of the book, which is like the first season or two of the show, you really get this idea of like people thinking, what the fuck, like how did we not see this coming?
Right.
And then there are other characters that are like, no, we did see this, they were more like activist-y. No, we did see this coming. We've been trying to protest. We've been trying, and you just weren't listening. You just weren't like supporting us. And so I see that now in a lot of these social media trends that seem very harmless.
I was going to say, don't you think it's also just like, chill, Amira, like I feel like you're just on edge. Isn't it just a girl who's like, whatever, I want the slow life and I don't want to do shit. And my husband's down to just take care of all of the monetary and financial aspects of our relationship. And I don't want to push anymore. And that's fine. Disappointing, but fine.
It can be fine, but then the more extreme version of that is and this is something I heard also on a podcast, so I'm not like an expert on the topic, but I just thought it was fascinating, this idea of what's called trad wives, and the term.
Dude, that's so scary.
Right. So it's scary because it's like the most extreme version of, if you take that soft life kind of aesthetic and weaponize it and dominate it and control it and make it more extreme and more intense in its core, then what you get is like the trad wives movement, which trad being a play on the word traditional, or like an abbreviation of the word traditional. And it's very much like a hearkening back to the very old school, what we would call maybe like regressive ways of living that is being used by right-wing movements to what is called like red pilling, to like radicalize people to this way of thinking and this way of life. And it's being co-opted, and the people that are being used really are like content creators. So anything that comes out on social media seems like, oh, it's like cute, it's interesting, it's
non-threatening. And I think this is also an evolution of like cottagecore. Do you remember like we have our Taylor Swift cottagecore era? People were really in love with the aesthetic of being in the countryside and long flowy dresses and like the Bridgerton corsets, and that was for me just like the early start where I've always loved vintage aesthetic. Like there's things about vintage design that are just so beautiful. Not a fan of the vintage expectations of women, but love the visuals. And there's a lot of creators online that I followed who wear vintage pieces, who dress in vintage, whether that's 1800s, 1920s, 1950s, like that's kind of the content that they're creating. And what I've seen as a shift is like it started with cottagecore. It's me frolicking in a nice dress in this beautiful field, and me wearing like a corset with these poofy sleeves, like making bread, because it's a visual. Right? It's just the visual. It's just visual content that I'm sharing to like satisfy the aesthetic, and the creativity has now become a place where these kind of like dog whistles and like subliminal messaging, not even subliminal, now it's like just straight up, they're just saying it, they're just saying the things that you can't believe that like young 25-year-olds are saying in the midst of that content. So you're making hot cocoa from scratch. We talked about this viral video where a girl is like making hot chocolate, and she goes all the way to the point of like cultivating the raw cocoa bean, cutting it, drying it over a 2-week process, grinding it herself, letting it dry more, using like, it's a whole 3-week thing. Fine. That's like pretty cool, right? I get to see how like the roots of hot chocolate could be made. But the way she now presents it is, my husband wanted hot chocolate. And so I have now slaved away for my entire existence of the last 3 weeks to make him this hot chocolate.
Which again, in its own, good for you. Like I wish I could do that as well. Like that's fine. I think people have to watch out for creators like that. And I don't follow this creator well enough to like know, but creators like that, then being, some of them are part of a movement that is very misogynistic, that has very misogynistic values, that's very aggressive in the way that it looks and thinks about women and their function in society. And that is there's a mobilization online that's going to make its way to the real world, like the offline world, that people need to be a bit more careful and watch out for. And it's very telling that this is the space where these movements are finding it easier to reach people, because it's not going to be when Trump is on the podium making outlandish statements about women. That's very easy for us to be distracted for weeks, slamming him and debating and bashing and how could you vote for, But what you don't realize, that's not where the big change comes. The big change is coming from this like simmering below the surface, kind of harmless stuff that is causing, it's kind of doing what we do, but on the reverse end. It's using like
what we as women do, you mean?
It's using storytelling, authenticity, soft aesthetics, kind of like genuine, like you're in home, you're in the kitchen, you're مش عارفة إيه, to deliver these very problematic messaging to women and men, not just women.
It reminds me of during the pandemic, there was a whole like new wave adoption of like the neo-hippie movement, this spirituality thing towards very problematic ideologies. And where all of a sudden creators that had conspiracy theories about like the political powers and very racist ideologies would use the same exact like aesthetic hints as the neo-hippie, you know, spiritual like quotes, Canva kind of pages and kind of let it slide, where there was this very discreet and slow way of indoctrinating their followers to make what seemed like a very little jump in their minds. And when you're so used to seeing content that looks a certain way, that feels a certain way, like you don't realize sometimes the problematic undertones that are actually being fed to you and how little by little, even if you don't, this is how gaslighting works. Like you might not believe what you're being told to believe the first time, the second time, the third time, the 100th time. But by the 101st time, you start to maybe think that they're right. And then slowly and surely those kind of add up. And that's what's very worrying for me, because those trends do convert to this part of the world and to our community.
The US should no longer be a reference, and thank God this, I mean, not thank God this year, but it's like one of the only good things that happened this year is in regards to the US versus the region, is that people don't see it, are no longer upholding it as much as they used to as a reference and a benchmark for like moralistic values, and so, which is completely accurate. It should not be on that high pedestal. At the same time, I think when it comes down to like the micro level of social media content, people need to be aware that there are movements happening, so that when they come across things, they have that awareness to protect themselves and their own minds, because there is a lot of elements of control there, you know, like there is people trying to win you over to a certain narrative. And it's not American per se only. There's also like a huge swing to the right in European political governments as well. It's happening all over the world. And I think that the more that this backlash, and it's very, right now, it's very like kind of essentialized into like women's rights, women's bodies, women's issues, the feminism taking over, feminism wanting men to like disappear, or hating men, or taking rights away from men. These are like the scary things that are weaponized, like we were saying, against people that are working for that space. So suddenly the word feminism, for example, in the context of all that we're saying, becomes like a dirty word, like we talked about before. It becomes like an evil thing that you want to protect your children against, that you want to protect society from. But that's only because it's being manipulated and misidentified and mislabeled to work for the like this other side and this other narrative.
Yeah, I want to point out that it might be because of your level of awareness, your level of education, your specific multicultural environment, and the dialogues you have with the community that you're directly involved in, that you feel like, oh, there's no way any of us still buy this thing, right? And my algorithm tells me that a lot of people align with me, because that's how algorithms are designed to perform. But one thing I've learned is that when you step out of that bubble, and I would say regionally, if you go towards the vast majority of Egyptian women, they're not necessarily, I'm just giving an example of Egypt because we're in Egypt, but this works for like the vast majority of women, of people, of young people in the world that are in more rural areas, that are in more homogenous cultural spaces, that might see aspects of Western culture on social media as quote unquote aspirational. And that for me is where the problematic element lies, is that when you're being talked to by an aspirational influencer, that's their role, is to influence people. It's now a known thing and an actual job. And these people who are there voluntarily trying to influence, they're handing a problematic type of ideology that works against those people as like an affluential, aspirational goal, you know, like it used to be that the only thing that reached the widest audience was film and television. And now within the region, we have a smartphone penetration that's higher than like one per one person, right? So statistically, there's more than one smartphone per person who has these apps pre-downloaded or access to these algorithms that are designed to feed them things.
Look, it's not, and I think there's a misunderstanding here. And no, it's not an immediate effect. I'm not saying this happened last week in America, so this week it's going to be like, that's the whole point, is that there is a slow trickle because all the channels are there. Social media, politics, like financial, whatever, control over different parts of the world. So it's going to make its way over here in different forms. It's also not going to take the same form because obviously it needs to be like localized for it to resonate, if it's going to resonate. I think what's more important than, is it currently affecting people in this region? Maybe not. Just the same way as, yani, is Trump, the idea of Trump as the potential coming president of probably, yani, of America, currently affecting us in the Middle East? No, right now, no. But are American politics affecting us in the region? Well, yeah. And at the root of this year specifically, like the effect that we've seen, the root of it is very much, we can talk about like colonialism, we can talk about the military industrial complex and whatever, but the root of it is white supremacy. It's not seeing that it's fighting for the right of Ukraine to resist Russia invasion, but not fighting for the right of resistance of the colonized Palestinian people to resist Israeli colonization and occupation. It's seeing white children dying as more valuable than seeing brown children dying. All of these things that we've been talking about all season that have seeped into the mainstream media, news organizations, whatever, that's where it stems from. And right now, that ideology and the people like leading that movement are very interested in co-opting women's issues, the conversation around women's bodies, social media trends around women, to forward their own agenda and their own narrative. And I think as people that exist on social media, that use social media, maybe you don't see it today, maybe you'll see it more now because this episode is gonna like trigger your algorithm, I don't know. But you should definitely be aware that this is happening in a country that's very much dominates the rest of the world in many, many ways, especially the region.
Especially culturally. I think that's like the big takeaway, is that even if that specific law doesn't have a trickle-down effect to a specific law here, we're talking again about mindsets and about culture's influence regionally. And the US has done a great job at being like a cultural powerhouse. I'll say the US is a cultural superpower.
Yeah.
I don't think they're like a superpower anymore. They're like less souped up than they
definitely
used to be.
Waning. But I think that like I do hear things that I hear in these like this content that we're talking about. I hear it from young people as like a joke. I've heard this like just yesterday. I don't want to specifically say who, but from a very young woman, like a 15-year-old, yani, who jokingly kind of was like, "Come on, man, like feminism, yani, I'm so tired. I don't want to work. I just want to like sit at home and bake," and as a joke,
right?
And the problem here is not that what she's saying is, I don't want to work, I want to stay home and bake. Like, no, you can do that if you like. Do whatever the fuck you want. That's the whole point. The point is to say that the counter of that is feminism. And to juxtapose the two as opposites and mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Right. And also maybe thinking that the veil has been lifted, and yet still hearing some people say things like, I just want a sugar daddy, which I've heard said by members of this crew as a joke multiple times, but I know would not necessarily turn down that situation. Like a lot of, that's the thing. It's like a lot of it, as you said, it's a joke until it's not.
Yeah.
And until the joke becomes a lot more comfortable than the reality.
It becomes a reality. And this idea also, like, again, because it's very important not to look at this as a critique of the soft life or the homesteading movement on, yani, it has really become a movement and as a lifestyle. That lifestyle, that's not a problem. Like, that's fine. And part of fighting for women to choose is being able to choose that lifestyle. If you want to be like a homesteader and do everything at home and harvest the crops and bake bread, and I want to make sure my rights are protected to be able to choose an alternative way of life and work, and we both can be friends and exist and coexist. The issue is, if once that aesthetic and that kind of content and that kind of ideology is taken and manipulated to tell you that the other side is wrong and the other side is what feminists want, and feminists are evil, and they want to take this away from you, and they want you to go out and compete in the corporate world. They don't want you to rest at home. No, that's not what feminism is
at all.
saying.
Yeah.
That's kind of I want to just detach that from each other, because that's the weaponization and mislabeling of things that's happening.
Damn.
Yeah. I mean, this is a lot. I'm also like,
well, I mean, I'm
not an expert on the subject. I'm very interested in these topics, and I think, yeah.
No, it's worth exploring. Even I've been choosing a more soft life approach, and for me, it doesn't mean like leaving work. It just means having a healthier pace to what I do. And I moved to the countryside, and I try to make my own bread, but it's pretty bad when I make it. And I live in France now, so I can buy it for pretty cheap, and it's delicious.
You are a great baker, though.
Okay, I'm a good baker, and I cook a lot, and I make my own whipped butter because it's freaking delicious, and I'm super happy about it. But I don't necessarily think that if I support other women's rights, that's going to take that away from me in any way, shape, or form. And
you wouldn't like villainize women that are choosing an alternative lifestyle. That's the
absolutely
problem. No, I know
the
you
whole
wouldn't,
point.
but like,
me,
would you villainize?
No, I'm just all about choice. Like, I don't get why people are so scared of giving someone a choice. If you educate people well, if you give them the choice, they will make the right choice, and that's just it. And the right choice for them, that might not be the thing that you want. Yeah, and the right choice is not what America wants us to believe also. So no. And in America specifically, with an election like there is coming up, there is no right choice. They're choosing between a wrong choice and a wrong choice, and that's the unfortunate reality. So if you can't choose on your political level who you're going to vote for, like a good choice, and I think there's going to be a lot of political abstaining this year, I would say that you can choose who you follow on the internet, and be very like cautious and conscious of who you choose and what of their ideologies you choose to accept or not. Yeah, but that choice, just so we're clear, is yours. No, like the choice of what U.S. president is the coming one doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because they're all working within the same system. Yeah, but it very much matters to the region because of all the things we know, how they're in charge of a lot of things, how their foreign policy affects our lives. So pay attention. Is it Captain Planet that says the power is yours? Yeah, earth, fire. Yeah. Thank you for listening to this long-winded episode of Sage Takes Time. We hope you learned something. Yeah, I'm curious to know who you guys follow. Have you been involved in any of these trends, or do you follow any creators that you think are like super amazing that people should follow, or problematic creators? I would be curious to know more. I've really just recently understood some of these creators that are in this space that are quite problematic, and I'm shocked at like how smoothly they introduce some issues. But yeah, we'd love to know more about you and your choices in the comment section below. Please like and subscribe and share this, and take care of your mental health and your algorithm. Support Womena, and see you.